Small flock poultry is really growing in popularity. I think, looking around the room here, it's a pretty big crowd for Kent County on a rainy night. So, and I think the reason for that is a lot of people are getting more concerned about where their food is coming from. Seems like most people are interested in having a layer flock or a few layers in the backyard. Well, my thoughts on it are we use the term backyard flock and small flock kind of interchangeably. In some ways, I think of a backyard flock as just a few chickens in your backyard, just providing for your own family, whereas a small flock may be something that you have more than 10 hens and you're actually trying to produce eggs to either sell them or give them to friends. So this number here was 7%. I think that's probably gone up in the past few years. That was from 2004. I don't know what the current figure is, but I'm sure it's a lot higher than 7%. It seems like it's been growing in interest phenomenally here over the past few years. So I'm just going to go over a little bit of basic terminology. Again, I hope I don't bore some of y'all. A hen is a mature female. Typically it's laying eggs. You may hear the term pullet. That is the term for a juvenile female. Technically, it's a female under a year old. Kind of the more common terminology is it's a female that hasn't started laying eggs. Once they start laying eggs, they're kind of referred to as hens. So roosters are, of course, the male. Cockerel is another term for a juvenile male. Some of the other terms you may hear that you may not quite know what they are. Broiler is a meat bird that has been raised up specifically to be harvested for meat. Some of the other terms you may hear are roasters, or a little bit bigger, raised to a little bit more weight. Heard one today, somebody said a baker, which is a really big one that has just kind of meandered around and gotten really big. And then the last term is stewers. Stewers are the laying hens that are no longer laying, and unless you want to keep them as pets, some people will harvest them for their meat, and they'll be called stewers because they go in a stew pot, basically. They're not very good for eating as far as the quality of the meat at that point. So, a chick, of course, everybody knows what a chick is. It's just kind of a generic term for the young bird. May also be called a peep. A few terms here: sexed and straight run. Sexed is when you're going to buy a day-old chick or a pullet that they may have, say that they've been sexed, and that has just separated out the males from the females. A straight run would be a mixture. Theoretically, you would get 50%, 50%. Be careful who you're buying from, because sometimes those males, as they're sexing them, will get pitched back in, and you'll end up with a little bit more than 50% males in your straight run. The reason you may want to buy a box of straight run chicks is if you're doing either if you're doing broilers, you don't really care what sex they are, or if you may want to buy a straight run and harvest the males when they get up to a certain size and just keep the females for laying. So that would be a time you buy a straight run. Straight runs are usually run a little bit cheaper than the sex birds. And of course, hatching eggs and incubators. You can buy the hatching eggs, the fertilized eggs, and hatch them out yourself. Breed, just like dogs have different breeds and cats have different breeds. There's lots of different breeds of chickens. Kind of some generic terms is they're called laying breeds or egg breeds. These are breeds that have been selected over the years to produce eggs. Similarly, there are meat breeds who have been selected for genetically to yield a better carcass. A lot of birds you buy end up being crosses, particularly like the Cornish cross broilers. That if you're thinking of doing a broiler flock, that would probably be the type of bird you would buy. Would be a cross. Sex-linked, that's a term that you hear once in a while. All that is it's a cross that when the chick hatches, you can tell what sex it is by what color it is. So it makes it a lot easier to sex those chicks. And you know when you get a box of them that the red ones are females, the red sex-linked or the black sex-linked. Again, those are usually crosses. I guess there are a few purebreds or breeds that will do that, but mostly it's crosses. Standard or large bird are kind of the same term versus a bantam. A bantam is just a smaller bird. There are breeds that are just bantams, there are breeds that are just large birds, and then there are breeds that can be both. So, fancy breeds are more of a show bird, and of course heritage breeds, there's a lot of interest in those. Those are kind of old breeds that may not have the production that some of the other breeds, more common breeds do, but there's still some interest in preserving those genetics. Brooding is a term for raising up a baby chick. It's when, from day old, from the time it hatches, you have to keep it at a certain temperature, keep it alive, and that's called brooding. Usually have a heat lamp over it. We'll get into a little bit more about that later. The last term I want to mention here on this slide was molting. Molting is a term we often hear that when a bird is losing its feathers, and particularly with a laying hen, as they lose their feathers, their production, egg production will slow down or even stop. So, and there are different, there's early molters and long molters, or late molters, excuse me. So as you're selecting a breed that you want to produce eggs from, you need to know whether it's an early molter or a late molter. We hear the term complete feed. That just means that everything that bird needs to grow and all its nutrient needs are in that complete feed. Versus a grain or supplement that may not have the whole full balanced diet. Starter, grower, finisher, and layer are examples of different complete feeds that are for the different stages of that bird's growth. As that bird grows, its nutrient demands are going to change, so we need to change the feed to meet it. Mash or crumbles or scratch is a description of the type of grind or how finely ground the feed is. The starters are usually mash, and then most people want to switch to a crumble. The mash is really fine, it's for us easily digestible for those small birds. Crumbles are a little bit easier to handle, not quite as dusty. So a lot of people switch to the crumbles after the birds get a little bit bigger. And then a scratch feed is just a coarser cracked grain. Medicated feed, it can either be medicated with antibiotics or a coccidiostat. Coccidia is a protozoal parasite that lives get in the gut of the chicken, and particularly in small birds, you need to be aware of that, control that. The feed tag, and it's going to have a lot of the nutrient information on it, the percent protein, fat. It'll have a list of ingredients. If it's medicated, it'll have what it's medicated with. If it's medicated, it'll also have the withdrawal time on it. Withdrawal time is the time you have to stop feeding before you can harvest that bird for meat. So be aware of that. All that information is on that tag. Also, it has how much you're feeding on there, so that you're not overfeeding the birds. But really, what we want to stress is, as you're planning your flock, you kind of have to start with the end in mind. What are your goals as far as having chickens? Are you going to be raising them for a 4-H project? Are you doing the egg layers or meat birds? Maybe you just want a pet. That's fine if that's what you want. Or maybe you want show birds. You know, these first 4 here, if you're living in a town, these first 4 you can do without roosters. The last one, the show birds, you're probably going to want to be breeding the birds, and you're going to need a rooster for that. So Showbirds are probably not going to be something you're going to want to do in town or where you have close neighbors. So you really need to start planning at least 6 months in advance before you actually get the birds. I kind of break it down into 3 considerations, or 3 things you need to be thinking about as you're starting planning. The first thing I want you to think about is the kind of the physical aspect of everything. The housing, where your house is going to be, where you're going to store your feed. Are you going to let the chickens have the whole yard, or are you going to keep them confined, in a smaller run like this? Again, kind of those, what the bird's environment is going to be. The second consideration I call the external. That would be things like zoning. You need to check the zoning to make sure you can have the birds. Not just the county zoning or the town zoning, but also a lot of people don't realize a homeowners association may have a restriction in it. So, does anybody watch Duck Dynasty? Remember why Jace couldn't have the chickens in his yard? Because the homeowners association wouldn't allow him to have them. So, check those things out. And the third consideration is what I call personal. That's going to be, you need to think about, number one, how much you're going to want to spend on these birds. If you're doing this to save money or to make money, you really need to put a pencil to it, because you're not going to save any money versus going to the store and buying eggs. It's got to be something you want to do, and but you still have to be able to budget out that bag of feed every month or every few weeks. And also, it is a daily commitment. Particularly once they get laying eggs, you want to be out there 2 or 3 times a day to check the egg, pick up eggs. If you go on vacation, you need to be prepared and have somebody lined up, ready to, take care of those birds for you. Be a good neighbor, and this is really, you kind of got to put yourself in your neighbor's shoes and take a look at things from their perspective. Walk down the street. If you think you're going to put the coop in this corner of your yard, walk down the street and see what it would, imagine what it might look like from the street or from the neighbor's house. Think about if they are going to sell their house, is it going to detract from the value of their house? So, be a good neighbor. Think about these things. But again, there are more and more backyard chickens popping up all the time. So here's the quote from the Washington Post. You can see a dramatic increase. And again, that was in 2004. So you can't imagine how many they have now. How fast can a chicken travel? Any guesses? Dylan? Faster than you can run? About 9 miles per hour. Doesn't matter what kind of livestock it is, sooner or later it's going to get out. You have to be aware of that and be prepared to either has to be tame enough to where it's going to come to you when you offer it some food, or you're going to have a method to corral it or catch it. Fishing nets work pretty good, long-handled fishing nets. I think Chris can attest to that at our poultry testing. We usually have an escapee or 2, so but they are pretty fast. So why do we have to have housing? Well, we need to protect those birds from the predators. Even in a town situation, we still have predators. The neighbor's dog. Foxes are getting pretty bold these days. I heard somebody mentioning foxes earlier. Hawks, birds of prey, still, they'll be in town and not pay much attention to a human. So we need to protect those birds from predators. Probably more important, we need to protect them from bad weather. And that's both rain and snow and the hot weather. So as you're kind of planning out where you're going to be setting the house, you may need to walk out there on a really rainy day and see what direction that wind's blowing, and kind of, you don't want your house pointed to where the opening's toward, you're going to get the wind blowing into it. So Similar, you go out there in a hot day, maybe you need to put it over into a shade a little bit. The wire on the houses, you want it small enough to prevent any predators from getting in. You may need to bury that wire underground, keep foxes or something from digging under it and getting into the chickens. Again, consider the proximity of the house before starting construction. A lot of towns have setbacks from the property line that you have to follow. And with a permanent house, you may need a building permit as well, so that will come into effect. Think about a location that drains well. If you're putting it up next to another building, think about the gutters or how the water will come off the roof. That could affect where you can put the house or the coop. Whether you want to run electricity to it or not, or how far you need to carry water. If you have kids, you can make them carry the water out. Of course, but the electricity gets to be a little bit more of an issue. You want a dry, draft-free house. That's what we're shooting for. If you have a run or outside run, you may want to cover it with mesh wire. Again, we have a lot of flying predators. If you do want to run, it may be convenient or may be more advantageous to build it long and narrow and to build some twist in it so that as that bird is diving, it doesn't have a straight shot at the chicken. You can also just run wires across the top, something that's going to just break that dive pattern of that hawk or predator. So, tall leafy vegetation, unless you're, again, here's kind of the difference between a backyard flock and a small flock. I don't think if you're in the backyard situation, you're going to want your birds running loose in across the yards. You're going to want to keep them more contained. But if you're out on, say you have a small farm, you may have some tall leafy vegetation that those birds can hide in. The protective dog near the coop, you got to be careful with that because some dogs will be protective and some dogs will think they're chew toys. So, but again, that is an option, and they do work well to keep fox away and some other pests. Birds need to have adequate space. They need to have an area to nest and to roost. They want to get up off the ground at night when they roost. So you have to kind of think about that and kind of plan those roost spots out for them. You don't want to put the roost right over top of where they're going to be eating, because as they're roosting at night, you don't want them dropping manure into the feed or into their water, or into the nest boxes that you're getting them laying eggs. So think about where they're going to roost. They typically want to go to the highest point in the structure. So again, if your nest boxes are higher than your roost, they're going to want to go into your nest boxes and roost at night. And again, that's going to create problems with a lot of droppings in there. So you'll end up with very dirty eggs. So you want to try to avoid that. And adequate space for bird also helps maintain lower humidity. And the reason we want to keep it dry in the coop is to avoid ammonia buildup and to keep those birds breathing in good fresh air. Obviously, a bigger bird is going to need more space. Some of the game birds, like a pheasant, are going to need a lot more space than a chicken will, just because they're more flighty birds and need that room to move. Fixed houses. Again, this is either an individual structure or it's built onto another structure. In either case, you're probably going to need a building permit for these. So just be aware of that. It may also affect your insurance. So these are things you got to think about as you're starting and doing some planning. The bottom picture here, if you have a run where you have birds, they're going to eat all the vegetation. So you need to figure out where that's going to cause the least amount of damage if you're going to leave them in one spot. You definitely don't want the gutters running right down into that, because you're going to have a mud hole. A lot of times they're called chicken tractors. I think Colchester Farms has one of these, and they're usually either wagons or skids, and they're just pulled around by a tractor, so you can move the birds to different sections of the field, and they'll eat the grass and or clean up the vegetables or whatever. Here's some smaller examples of this. This one over here, he's probably raising broilers on pasture. There's been a lot of interest in pasture poultry lately. That's one of the niche markets that some people are getting into. Again, here's one built out of PVC pipe. This one here, I don't know if that would be very permanent or not. I think that's more of a playpen than a good coop, a good long-term coop. And Dr. McCray made a good point. If you're going to get something, you're going to need to get down into these birds from time to time, particularly to clean them out. If you build something up that's at a good level, it's going to be easier for you to get in there and clean it out. You're more likely to do a better job. Some of these lower things, a lot of people call them poultry arcs. They can be a little harder to get into and clean. So just be aware of that as you're planning, and think about how are you going to clean these structures out. And we can be fairly creative with some of these coops. That one's pretty attractive, actually. I like that. I wouldn't mind seeing that in my neighbor's yard. But that one, I don't think I'd like to see. That's definitely something that would be on a small farm somewhere where you didn't have neighbors very close. Again, dog kennels can work, even dog houses. I think this was, can't really see on this one, but this is at a, I think they want to say it's a public park, but there's actually a padlock on there to keep people out. So just be aware of that too, that if you're in an area where there's a lot of people going by, you probably want to put either a lock on it or something to keep people from opening those gates. They want to go in and see the chickens, and again, next thing you know, they run 9 miles per hour and you're out there chasing. I mentioned this earlier, chicks require a heat source for the first few weeks of life. The gas hover stove is kind of for a bigger operation. Most people use a heat lamp for 20 to 50 chicks. There's kind of an art to this. You want to get it adjusted so that those birds don't clump up in any one spot. If you get it too drafty, they'll clump up to one side to try to get out of that wind. If it's too hot on them, they'll move to the outside. Or if it's too cold, they'll kind of all try to huddle right underneath that lamp or a heat source. As long as you can keep them spread out, that's best. They want to, when they want to bunch up like that, they'll actually almost smother each other sometimes. So, birds usually start laying about 20 weeks of age. You can also purchase, if you don't want to raise the chicks or brood the chicks, you can purchase started pullets, usually about 18 to 22 weeks of age. They are, of course, going to be a little bit more expensive, but by the time you figure in feed for raising it for those 20 weeks, you may be ahead of the game. Again, I mentioned roost a little earlier. You want to provide sleeping for the hens and the replacement pullets. And here's 6 inches per bird, 12 inches apart. One board is 12 inches apart, and then 24 inches above the floor. It gets them up off the ground. That's what they seem to like. The nest box, you want to provide one nest box for each 5 hens. Again, place this up off the floor and away from the roost, so that you want those birds to roost on those roost boards at night, not in the nest box. Give the young birds a few weeks to adjust to them before they're really ready to start laying eggs. And then once they do start laying eggs, you need to collect them fairly often. There's a term I did mention earlier, it's called broody. When a hen becomes broody, she wants to sit on her eggs and hatch them out. And they can get a little aggressive when they get broody. And so the more often you take those eggs out, the quicker she's going to go through that broodiness cycle. And some birds will never get broody, and some birds get broody quite often. Different breeds are similar. Some breeds are more broody than others. So you may want to look at that as you're picking out a breed as well. I know Dylan knows this one. What determines the color of the eggshell? Anybody else know?
Color of the earlobe.
Color of the earlobe.
I thought it was the breed.
Well, the breed will have a different color earlobe, but there can be a black breed that has a white earlobe and will lay a white egg. Feeding and watering, make sure you have a reliable water source nearby. Again, if you have kids, that's considered a reliable water source. A watering can works really good. It's a lot cheaper than burying a line out to your chicken coop. So, but when possible, place the drinker in the outside runs. That keeps the humidity in the coop a little lower, and it also will help keep that water cleaner from them roosting and bubbling. And then drinkers and feeders should be cleaned and monitored on a routine basis. You want to, especially in the summertime, if they're outside, they'll get algae starting to grow in them. You want to clean them out fairly regularly. There are all different types of feeders, trough feeders. Here's a homemade feeder. They can fill it up at the top, and it'll probably hold several days worth of feed. And of course, you can, like I said, you can either buy them or you can make them. So it's a whole lot of different options out there as far as feeders. Again, think about the bird and the size of the bird and how much space it's going to need to drink and to eat. Getting into the feeding, 60 to 70% of the cost is the feed of the animal. So again, if that's an area that if you're doing this to save money or to make money, that's what you've got to be looking at is the cost of that feed. I have on the resource list that Sabine passed out. There's a couple of feed stores listed on there, Kingstown and Delmarva Feed are the two here in Kennedyville where you can get chick feed. But also be sure, again, that you're using the right type of feed for the age of the bird you're raising. That's where I got into those growers and finishers and layer rations. Complete feeds are formulated to meet all the nutrients. Blending with other grains will dilute it. So you may like to give your birds treats, but if you do that on and off or very often, you're going to be reducing their nutrient. You may be reducing their nutrient level. So they may not be laying quite as much as you would want, and maybe it's because you're giving them those treats. Once in a while, kind of like treat for your dog. You know, once in a while it's okay, but they tend to, skip their feet a little bit and want to wait for the treat to come along sometimes. Guess you can say that about kids too. They kind of wait for dessert. A couple of charts, and again, these are in the bulletin of how much birds consume. That can give you a good idea if you're planning out, how often you're going to have to buy feed.
What's the time period there? It says 104 pounds
Here we go.
for layer.
From 17, from day old to 6 weeks, that one bird is going to consume 4 pounds. This is for brown egg layers. One bird is going to consume 4 pounds. So if you have 5 birds, you're of course going to have to figure out on 20 pounds. From 7 to 18 weeks, it's going to consume 46 pounds of the growth. And then from 19 to 70 weeks, they'll consume 104 pounds per bird.
White layers less than brown layers?
That's what this chart says, yeah.
That's why in the United States of America, we rely on the single comb white leghorn. The laying hen industry developed in Petaluma, California, and they were starting with the brown shelled egg layers, and then there was a gentleman who came down from Canada with the single comb white leghorns, and they ate a third less and laid more. That's why we have white shelled eggs in the United States grocery stores.
And again, here's similar for broilers, for meat bird.
How do free-range birds feed into, meld into all this? How do they figure into this?
Free range, they're obviously not going to eat as much of the feed. They're going to be scavenging for some feed. They're not going to grow as fast, or they're not going to lay as much, produce as much. So, you know, that's kind of in your goals there when you're starting out. That's, you know, it's more important for you to have a free range bird. You just have to, you're giving up that production. There'll be times that, you know, that they can get into some very high quality forage or something that they will produce well, but there's going to be other times where they're eating more, coming back and looking at more grain. Having a timer in your house can be a benefit. And it's not very expensive. So here it's saying for a laying flock, you want to have 14 hours of light per day. And again, those timers, I have rabbits, and rabbits don't like to breed in the winter time, but if you put a light in there, I have a light that stays on till 8 o'clock at night, and then it comes on a few hours earlier in the morning before sunlight. So gives them the same kind of photo period. And like I said, they're fairly easy to install. It's just a plug in and set the time. If you're going to use artificial light and you're, again, in a neighborhood, think about where that light's going to travel at night, and is it going to affect your neighbors? Are they going to be bothered by it? Is it going to shine in their bedroom window at night? Selecting the birds themselves, buy from a reputable hatchery. One that participates with the NPIP, National Poultry Improvement Plan, and you know, some people want to go to these either an auction. I know Dill's auction, some occasionally have some chicks there. You're really taking a big chance if you go to an auction and buy something like that. You don't know what you're getting. Do they do chicks anymore? Or
Don't buy from Dills.
don't. No. I agree. Whatever species of
Sell
animal
at
you're-
Dills. Don't buy from Dills.
And swap themselves or swap meats. They're probably maybe a little step above Dills, but not too much. You can run into some problems there. You just, again, try to look for somebody, either a reputable breeder or somebody that's involved with the NPIP. And there's some, the swap themselves are kind of a touchy subject. Some people love them, some people hate them. I don't know what your opinions are here.
We'll go into it next week.
All right. Some people are just kind of more in tune with their animals. That's part of what's called animal husbandry, the study of the flock for disease, for discomfort. Watching those birds to see how much they're eating. That can be fairly important, and also how much they're drinking. So maybe you need to designate one person who's going to go out and do that every day, and you know, somebody who's who's in tune with those animals, and maybe the other person or the other spouse could go out once in a while and see if there's anything big that the other one might not have noticed. But with experience, you should be able to look at birds and determine if they are healthy and comfortable. And just remember that you are working with a live animal, and it is a daily process. You got to make sure they're cared for. You're going to have laying hens. You're going to have to be there 365 days a year. Just touch on vaccinations a little bit. Most of the chicks that you buy from the NPIP hatcheries are going to be vaccinated when you get them. Some of the birds, if you buy from a breeder, you may or may not. Vaccinations, most small flocks are not vaccinated because the vaccines come in vials that cover 500 or 1,000 birds, and just the cost factor. And there aren't a lot of vets that will vaccinate birds. They don't want to put that money out and fill that vaccine for a few birds either. So buy birds from a hatchery, you may want to consider vaccination if you're going to a lot of poultry shows where you're mixing birds with other flocks. If you buy birds from hatcheries, auctions, or again the swapping cells, and adding them into your existing herd or flock. Again, my beef coming out in here. Or if you've had disease, again, you can get the vaccines from some of the hatcheries or poultry supply. I know down on the lower shore you can get some of the vaccines, but again, they're produced in such large quantities that it's kind of impractical almost, but you may want to coordinate with your neighbors. If you do want to do it, you want to do the entire flock at one time. So I'll leave that for Dr. McCray for next week as well.
We'll come with that.
Or come with 2 pets. Some other things to consider, biosecurity. We are in a very intensive poultry area with the commercial poultry here on the shore. If something were to happen to that industry, it would be very, very economically hurtful for the shore, whole economy. So there's some information on some of the websites about biosecurity. Think about isolation, traffic control, and sanitation. Will you touch on that more? Good. So I'll just leave that. Go with that. Disposal of dead animals kind of goes hand in hand with biosecurity. There's an old saying, if you have livestock, sooner or later you're going to have dead stock. It's going to happen. You're going to lose birds. You have to have a plan in place of how you're going to deal with those birds. It mentions down here composting. As a backyard flock or small flock, I really kind of discourage trying to compost because most people can't get the pile hot enough to kill the bacteria to really do a good job of composting. So I did check with the Humane Society. They do cremation of pets, so they would probably, if you had 1 or 2 birds, they would probably be a resource that you could go to and have your birds cremated. Burial is not an option either. Some people think you just dig a hole and throw them in it. That's a big no. So I think that's
what they do with us.
Because of groundwater contamination. You don't want, you're putting that whatever killed that bird out there in the environment, basically. And also along the same lines as composting, if you're doing that in your yard and your neighbor's dog smells it, they're going to dig it up. And then they're going to carry it over to the neighbor's house and put it on the porch or on the living room floor. And you'll get some nasty calls then. So that's the best case scenario is to cremate it, to get it to someplace that can incinerate it. That's least worry. A little bit about the manure. I did a talk a couple weeks ago. Maryland also has, similar to Kootastic, we have the Mid-Atlantic Small Flock Conference over in Westminster. And I did a talk there on using manure on the garden. A few facts here. 4-pound chicken is going to produce about, this says 28 to 80 pounds. That's a big range, but I did some figuring from working with the management, and yeah, it's going to be closer to the 80 pounds. If you're collecting it all, if it's confined the whole year or 24 hours a day, it's going to produce, you know, a good amount. A lot of people want to use that on their gardens. That's fine as long as you take some precautions and kind of follow the USDA's rule, the 90-120 rule. And again, this is for fresh manure. More than 120 days prior to harvest. So if you're putting that out on a crop that has edible portions in contact with the soil. So anything that grows under the soil, like carrots or radishes or potatoes, 120 days at least. And for anything that doesn't have contact with the soil, 90 days. A lot of the crops that we don't think about could have potential. Back up a little bit. The reason you want to do this is to prevent any bacterial or microbial contamination of your food, because those birds can have some bacteria in their systems that can make you sick. So stuff like leaf lettuce or fresh greens, stuff that you're eating raw, that's kind of a high risk produce. Again, the stuff that's grown underground is high risk. Another high risk is watermelons, because they're laying right on the ground. Even though you're not eating that rind, that bacteria can get into them. So just be aware of that. Incorporate the manure into the soil, and don't side dress with raw manure. And lastly, proper composting can help. Again, a lot of people don't get that compost hot enough to kill all this bacteria. This right here is a composter that I just built a few weeks ago out of a 55-gallon barrel. I'm working with it a little bit with my rabbits, trying to get that manure to compost. And if anybody has rabbits, it has a lot of straw and sawdust in it. It's pretty hard to compost. So I'm having a little bit of trouble. So I'm going to tweak that a little bit, and maybe we can do some more programs this spring on composting. A few other things to consider: flies. Again, we don't want those flies bothering the neighbors. We want to keep good relations. Reduce any decaying organic matter, because that's where those flies are breeding in, and keep it dry. That's a big step toward keeping the fly population down. Rodents and wild birds. Clean up any spilled feed that you might have that might attract those rodents. And again, as Dr. McCrae said, wild birds, you want to kind of limit the exposure to wild birds for disease purposes. And then, again, kind of going back to the neighbor thing, think about the smells and the sight and the noise that's going to be coming off of your backyard flock and how that's going to affect your neighbors. I mentioned roosters, that you don't want to have roosters in a close neighborhood. I guess there are some breeds that are more vocal than others, even in the hens. So you may want to do a little bit of research in that. And there's some people like to have guineas for insect control. Guineas are quite noisy. They make good watchdogs. They're not something you would probably want to have in a town limit. Coming down to the end here. All poultry in Maryland, doesn't matter if you have 1 chicken or 100 or 50,000, all poultry must be registered with the Department of Agriculture. You have to have a premise ID. And you can go to the MDA website. Again, I have it on that contact resource list of the website where you can go and fill out that form. There's no charge for that. It's really to kind of keep an idea in case there is a disease outbreak of where the flocks are, so that can be controlled. And again, just, you know, in conclusion, just really put some planning and thought into it, and like I said, start probably 6 months ahead of time before you're really ready to buy the birds.